Is this on? Yes. Hello and welcome to this session on who owns the news and why it matters. I'm delighted to have you here today. You can see there's the hashtag is up there. And we're going to have time for questions at the end. There is no timer up here, so, but I'm expecting the discussion we have to be really informative and lively. We've been talking about funding challenges facing the news industry for years, and yet still very rich men want to own the news, whether it's Jeff Bezos and the Washington Post, or the LA Times in the US, or the Telegraph and the Observer in the UK, and a host of local papers across the globe. In an age of declining trust, the issue of how we fund and sustain independent ethical journalism is more important than ever. My name's Jane Martinson. I've been investigating news owners for many years, so I am delighted that I've got this fabulous panel of people to talk about it. On my right, we have Branko Brkic, who is, after a long career as a publisher, last year set up Project Continuum, a global initiative to enhance and talk about sustainable journalism around the world, who's also founder and editor for many years of the Daily Maverick in South Africa. To his right, we have Basia Cummings, who is the new digital editor of The Observer, which is going to relaunch in 2 weeks' time under the brand new ownership of Tortoise Media. And for the last 6 years, Basia has been a partner and an editor at Tortoise, during which time she's been responsible for some incredible award-winning podcasts, including Pig Iron, among others, which is about the death of a freelance journalist. Last but not least, we have Yoshi Herman at the end, who is the founder and editor of Mill Media, which I'm quoting from the FT here, John Burn-Murdoch, who said, it's one of the most interesting and impressive media startups of the past decade. As you can tell, we are going to be talking about the news business globally, nationally in the UK and elsewhere, and also locally, because they all fit together. I'm going to start off, Branko, with you, because there's a sort of issue here where there are moments in history where the ownership of news really matters. Do you think this is one of those moments, and why?
I would say that it matters all the time, in the good and bad times, but of course, in bad times it becomes crucial. So, we can remember the ownership and resistance that Katharine Graham has shown in Washington Post in the early 1970s and in a way saved American democracy in those days. This is one of those moments. And if I may just say, if we look back in a few years back, we can actually pinpoint moments when things went south. And one of those moments was when Mr. Bezos decided to pull the endorsement of Kamala Harris from Washington Post. A few days before that, LA Times revoked their endorsement. Mr. Patrick Soon-Shiong, another South African. I'm sorry, guys, we are actually exporting a lot of crazy South Africans of late. We used to be known for exporting Mandela. Now we're exporting, crazy guys. So when Jeff Bezos revoked that endorsement, something very important happened. We, as a fourth estate, we happen to be protected from the bad guys, let's call them bad guys, not by a lot of money or guns or walls. We have those invisible walls. And the way you puncture that wall is you show fear. And, Jeff Bezos and decision has shown fear, that it just made a little puncture in that wall. And that was the moment when Trump smelled that fear and being who he is, just ran straight through it. A few days later, USA Today revoked their own endorsement. And then you could actually see the business leaders coming along, and all of them as Timothy Snyder says, in a moment of Bayans in advance, have shown that actually Trump is somebody they can trust and somebody they can work with. So those moments, those pivotal moments, are there for the true leaders to show what they're made of. And unfortunately, this generation of media owners in America is not made of that. So a couple of other moments were really important. One of them is the ABC settlement, a ridiculous settlement where Trump has sued them for George Stephanopoulos, saying that Trump was rapist instead of liable for rape, which is exactly the same thing in the New York law. And they settled with $15 million donation to Trump's charity. Trump doesn't have charities. And the second one, which is happening right now, where CBS is negotiating its takeover by Larry Ellison, the son's family. And they're actually keen to settle this ridiculous court case where Trump is suing 60 Minutes for nobody knows what, for editing of Kamala Harris' interview. Yeah, and he's now raised the threat from 10 billion to 20 billion. So if that thing actually gets settled, the reverberations, the bad example is going to be set, which is going to cost us decades of trust and decades of strength. So it is absolutely crucial who owns the media.
And the sort of rich man behaving badly, which is effectively what's happened to the LA Times, the Washington Post, it actually, they lost readers of once liberal journalistic, and the Washington Post, obviously, historically, independent, fiercely independent media, and readers sort of left in droves. Basia, in many ways, there'll be people in this audience who see an ownership by a foundation, by a trust, like the Scott Trust, who changed The Guardian, and which was recently sold to The Observer to Tortoise Media as the ideal model. Tell us about, firstly, why did Tortoise, which is a new startup, also set up by a very distinguished journalist, James Harding, done brilliant work, digital, no print. Why, first of all, on earth did they want to buy the world's oldest Sunday news title? And secondly, can you talk about that sort of the structure of the ownership and what you're going to sort of, as Tortoise owner, what you're going to bring?
Absolutely. Well, it's a pleasure to be here to talk about The Observer and our plans for it. So I think initially the approach to the Scott Trust and to The Guardian by James and Tortoise Media to buy The Observer was a love letter. In the UK, you can see for the last few years that The Observer was not The Guardian and its owners' strategic priority, and they were very clear about that. They are building a digital global brand for The Guardian, and The Observer is a separate brand that didn't fit into that priority, and that is something that they were clear about. And I think, therefore, there was an opportunity to think, okay, so The Observer doesn't have its own digital presence. It exists only on The Guardian's website. It doesn't have its own podcasts, newsletters, live events. And these are things that Tortoise, with similar values of, progressive, liberal, independent journalism, has been innovating and championing for the last 6 years. So I think it was a kind of idea that we could offer to The Observer things that it didn't currently have, and together that we could build something new that was the sole focus, that wasn't trying to run two brands, that will focus on The Observer, focus on bringing it a brand new, digital, younger readership that will see it into the future. Of course, it would be disingenuous if I didn't acknowledge that it was a bumpy ride, and it was met with a lot of emotion, and pain amongst journalists in the UK. But I think in that, and I think we'll talk about that, it revealed, I think, some things that are really important around mission, around how valued these titles are. And I think it has made us really think about what we as custodians of this title owe it and our responsibilities to it.
Thank you.
Do you want me to talk about the kind of ownership structure? I realise that's a bit I didn't answer.
Yeah. I mean, you were talking about the Scott Trust ownership structure.
Yes.
But yeah, talk about Tortoise and how that's going to change.
So James Harding is our editor-in-chief. This is the kind of first big investment in liberal journalism in the UK in around 30 years, 25 million raised to invest in The Observer. The investors, no investor has a controlling stake, and they are all, none of it is venture capital money, so it's not about making a quick buck. These are investors that we are very proud of, and once the deal closes on the 22nd of April, so we're getting very close, they will be available publicly, but most of them have already been announced. So I think it's understandable that there was scrutiny and anxiety, as there, scrutiny is always welcome, that's our job. But I think there is a lot to be excited about, and definitely for the new colleagues who have now started to move into our offices and to start work with us in the same place, there's a lot of excitement.
I want to come back and talk about the sort of structure of ownership in a bit, but Yoshi, can we also talk about we've talked about global news organisations, obviously a sort of a huge digital organisation taking over a really old newspaper product. In local news, globally, there's been a real crisis. And if you want to look at the impact of finance and sort of financial-only measures, a quarter since the start of this century, a quarter of the news titles in the US, UK been wiped out. Half of American dailies are owned by financial organisations, which have, the model is typically, I know there are exceptions, but typically they, sack the staff, sell the properties and give the money to investors and don't invest in news. You are one of several very exciting new startups in the space. And you did it actually longer ago than many, actually even longer ago than Tortoise. Tell us about your idea of local. What you do is actually long-form local journalism. If anyone doesn't know, Mill Media's work, it's in six cities in the UK via email subscriptions, mainly, isn't it? You subscribe to the newsletter, and it's brilliant. But tell us about why you thought of doing it like that and why you saw the need.
Yeah, I guess one of the motivations for doing it is that there's been this sort of epochal collapse in local journalism. The business model for local journalism has been destroyed because it used to be a local advertising business and a very profitable, lucrative one. I think ownership comes into that, actually. Some of the local news companies in the UK and the US, I don't know so much about other countries, are clearly in the hands of owners who don't prioritise journalism. My personal feeling is that we need a lot of private capital and private ownership in journalism. We need a lot of private investment, but you need to have owners who really care about the product. And I think if you look at some of the local news groups in the US, they are being gutted year on year, thousands of layoffs. Because what they are doing is they are protecting a profit margin. So they would rather lay off 1,000 people over the course of a year and protect a 20% profit margin than invest in the kind of things in the newsroom that will lead to revenue growth. So that's bad ownership, I think. That's the kind of ownership you don't want. If you look at some of the large media companies in the UK that own local newspapers, they seem to be doing the same thing. They're stock market listed companies who don't seem to have journalism at the kind of corporate heart of it. So for me, coming in, I suppose I'm a journalist who wanted to do a certain type of journalism in Manchester. I started the company on my own. It's really just like one journalist writing one story a week. That's how we started. We now have 20 journalists on staff and dozens more sort of regular contributors. And the whole ethic of the company is that we want to make high quality local journalism like financially sustainable. It has to be commercially sustainable. I don't think it will be a success if I grow this company and we have 100 staff, but we're incredibly reliant on large grants. I don't think that will be a success. So what we're trying to do is get to commercial sustainability. When we raised private finance 2 years ago, the kind of people who invested are media people who care about journalism, who think we're going to do a good job, and who believe in commercially sustainable reporting. So I think, you know, I'm a journalist, and I'm also a media owner now. To come back to the Tortoise example, James Harding started Tortoise because he loves journalism. He didn't do it because it's the best way to make money. He could have got a lot of jobs in the city, would have made him a lot more money. They have put millions of pounds into original journalism. They've done some of the best podcasts in the country over the past few years. So I would say, you know, my business model is a little bit different to Tortoise's. We probably haven't spent as much money, but, you know, I like the idea of journalists who really believe in what they're doing, starting media companies. I think that is a good model, and I think if they can raise private capital rather than going down the philanthropic non-profit route, all the better.
How difficult is it, though, to make money? And we talked about the crisis. I've been coming to Perugia for years, and I've written about media for even longer. You know, the coming of the internet has meant that the business models were crushed. How do you make money? Your model is different from Tortoise. I know Branko has views about this, but is there a one-size-fits-all? You know, what are you doing to make money?
Well, definitely not one-size-fits-all, and I'm very aware at this conference that there are people who operate in very different contexts around the world where subscription revenue, reader revenue, large advertising revenue is not as possible. But I think that there is a very optimistic case to be made that there are a lot of people who want high-quality journalism. There are a lot of people who are willing to pay for it. And there are now lots of examples around the world of people starting small, low-cost media companies like ours, doing really high-quality reporting and getting people to pay. We are profitable in the first 4 cities where we launched. The only places where we're still investing money, i.e. not making money, are our 2 new launches in London and Glasgow, because we literally launched them, you know, a matter of a few months ago. So it's a sustainable model. I don't think that would work in a sort of you know, in a village. I think in different contexts and in different countries and in low-income areas, clearly there need to be different models. But I think there are a lot more opportunities to make money in journalism than people realise, and that is because it is now possible to produce journalism at a much lower cost. It wasn't possible in the 1980s for me to start a new outlet and get, you know, 10,000 people paying across 6 cities within 5 years. That wouldn't have been possible. I would have needed millions of pounds behind me. Because of the internet and because of the way you can publish now, we used to publish on Substack, now we publish on Ghost. The marginal cost of publishing an article is basically 0. So you can create sustainable media companies on a totally different cost base. And I think we should be optimistic about that, because I think at events like this we do hear quite a lot of pessimism. I think I'd be optimistic about the sustainability in journalism. I think I'd be optimistic about private capital coming into it and for-profit companies flourishing in some of these markets.
Do you think it's hard, though, as you mentioned, it's different in different parts of the world? How do you punch through? It is easy. You know, you could set up, go to Manchester. You wanted to live in Manchester. You could, you know, come and set up in Perugia and do something here. How do you punch through and make sure that you are heard, your organisation is heard in a news industry that is so full?
Jane, you'll need to come to our panel at 2 p.m. We're going to explain how we use storytelling to break through. But a big belief of mine is that too much of media is based around incremental news updates. That not enough of it prizes storytelling. I think people have got too much information being thrown at them, but I think there is a massive dearth of good storytelling. Storytelling is what we do with each other in a pub. It's what we've done for thousands of years. And I think the type of narrative storytelling that we do, that Zetland does, that the New Yorker does, that the Atlantic does, is very attractive to people. That's how we punch through. We told stories in a narrative fashion with feeling and with emotion, and that connect with people on a deeper level than just, here's the information you need to know today. And I think there's a lot of room for other people to do that in media.
Basha, can you talk about the sort of business model? I know Tortoise, 6 years, it's not making money. Obviously now it's a huge, big investment in Tortoise. What's the sort of game plan going forward? When do you see it becoming profitable? What's the plan? And I know you are on the editorial side, but as a partner, talk about the plan.
I should say that Tortoise became profitable in the final quarter of 2023. But yes, we have sustained losses. And I think that is an interesting question in terms of, the number of media companies that make money is small. And, but the plan for us, for The Observer, what we know from its ownership under GNM was that it didn't have a dedicated commercial team selling advertising. It wasn't being pushed in front of advertisers. So one of the first things we're doing is building that relationship and trying to get advertising within the newspaper and the magazine, and really showing what the New Observer can be. We also are adding a whole slate of audio to The Observer, which then includes possibilities for IP and advertising there, newsletters, live events, business partnerships. I think there is so much opportunity for The Observer. It is beloved. I grew up with it in my home, and when I told my mum that this was happening, she went and dug out these little supplements that were published in the 90s called The Tiddler, which were these hilarious, sexy, saucy, rude little supplements of The Observer, and she'd hung on to them all of that time. It really means something to people. But I think it has not been in the public conversation as much as it should have been and could have been. And I think we are hoping to revitalise that. And I think the other thing to say is that print is in, as we know, a period of structural decline. And we know that print readers are predominantly older. What we think we can do by bringing a younger digital readership to The Observer is to bring a whole new generation into its readership, which I think is an amazing opportunity.
And paying through subscriptions.
Yes. So in 2 weeks' time, you will see the first edition of the New Observer published on the 27th of April. We'll launch a new website, a dedicated observer.co.uk website, which we will be running for free for the first few months, because we think it's really important that people can see what this dedicated digital destination for The Observer will be. Over time, once we're comfortable that we've found our groove, we've hired the people we need to hire, that we've brought the two newsrooms together, we're all going to be working in one place. We will be The Observer, not Tortoise in The Observer. We will begin to ask people to pay for it, because we think that that is a principle that is important. Tens of thousands of people pay for The Observer on a Sunday, and we think if you read it digitally, you should pay also.
Branko, we've talked about, obviously, two ideas, sort of independent journalism by journalists, mainly, although we're going to talk more about ownership. But lots of these people, Jeff Bezos, for example, the Barclay brothers with the Telegraph, they don't buy newspapers to make money. Joshi said that about James. You could have earned more money. Nobody really goes into journalism to make loads of money. But these owners typically don't mind losing money because they gain so much more. Do you think that's got worse in an age of big tech?
Well, just to clarify, they used to make a lot of money.
Until the last 20 years, they haven't, because of advertising.
They used to print money.
Yeah. Licensed print money.
Yeah, look, I have a theory, and I hope I'm wrong. My theory is that within 5 to 10 years, if we continue the way we are, there'll be pretty much no media houses in the world outside of the big sustainable ones. But those big sustainable ones are going to be bought by big tech. We are being bombarded by statements from big tech guys, and actually a lot of us are saying that nobody's trusting us anymore. We are nobody's. Literally, we mean nothing anymore. For the sector that means nothing and nobody is listening to, they're spending a hell of a lot of time and money trying to kill us. Literally, the big chunk of right-wing media exists to throw mud at mainstream media or lamestream media. They call it every day. That's the main editorial content. But again. I think the next big step that's going to happen is that big tech is going to move in and buy, offering ridiculous amounts of money for the big media titles, including the New York Times. You heard it first. I think New York Times within 5 to 10 years is going to be a massive target of a takeover.
And
the way Murdoch bought the Wall Street Journal in the early 2000s.
And there's no sign, I mean, I suppose what's interesting, the only deal that's been blocked is not about big tech owners buying any other, because that's going to be really hard. But we have in the UK and other parts of the world with, so a member of the ruling party, ruling family of Abu Dhabi was the main financial backer of the bid, a slightly complicated bid for the Telegraph Media Group. And that was going to go ahead until there was a huge fuss politically. And that stopped when the national government said, no, we cannot have another foreign state. But that doesn't stop any individual owner.
No big tech, Big tech is fine.
Yoshi, how would you feel if, well, let's not say Elon Musk, but Zuckerberg, Bezos says, you know, we really like what you're doing locally. We think we can give you loads of money. How would you react?
I think that's very unlikely.
Yeah, that's just pushing back the question. How would you react?
But if I could just make the positive case, Branko knows a lot more about media than me, so that's the caveat. But currently, big tech companies are not buying our major media companies. And I think that's a pessimistic case.
They're owners, the individual people.
Yeah. I mean, how much has the New York Times share price increased since Mark Thompson took over? I don't know, 10x, 15x? I don't know, someone look it up. Like, it is an unbelievable success story. They now employ more journalists at the New York Times than at any time in their history. They were so close to bankruptcy that they took a $200 million loan from a Mexican telecoms billionaire about 15 years ago. They were looking to have to sell their building. They are now growing. They have, they're publicly listed. They have got thousands of journalists. They're doing unbelievable audio journalism. I mean, is there a future in which they get bought by someone? I doubt it. I don't think most tech companies particularly want to have a media company on their books. I don't think the New York Times will be bought by anyone like that. I think we should actually take huge confidence from the success of the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, The Economist, the FT, NY Mag, the New Yorker, all of these companies that have added hundreds of thousands of paying subscribers over the past decade and that have turned high-quality journalism, albeit in wealthy markets, into a profitable and into a growing concern. So I guess I would take the positive side of Branko's wager, but you know, of course there are some bad owners out there, but I think on panels like this we tend to focus on the bad rich guy owners and we don't talk about the family that's owned the New York Times for 120 years, that's shepherded it better than any media company on the planet.
Partly because there are fewer and fewer of them. You mentioned the New York Times, but increasingly, I mean, the Washington Post had a very famous, we talked about Catherine Graham, briefly mentioned. And I also don't want to romanticize it.
Just 1 second. I hope you're right. And, you know, I hope I'm wrong, hope you're right. Just want to remind you the takeover of the Wall Street Journal. There was a highly successful family-controlled, you know, Dow Jones, and they were valuing it at $1.5 billion, and it was seen as a cheeky, you know, daring, you know, evaluation. Murdoch came in and was ready to offer 5. Okay, because he desperately wanted it. So I just want to, you know, we're talking about people who have a lot of money. A lot of it is paper money.
But the Wall Street Journal does amazing journalism.
No. I'm not complaining. I'm just saying in principle. Yeah. The New York Times, as successful as it is, and it's a shining success right now in our global media space. Revenues of New York Times are less than a week of Google revenues. You know, so we're talking about imbalance in power, okay, and that imbalance in power leaves us incredibly vulnerable. And the way I understand big tech, they're afraid of a few things. One of them is regulation/legislation. The other one is the media. You know, and yeah, it doesn't take too much imagination to see the next move.
Because it's the power of the media. I mean, we've touched on how important is it, the sort of journalist. Mark Thompson, obviously, a journalist for a long time before he took over, well, first the BBC and then the New York Times, doing quite difficult job at the CNN at the moment. But how important is that, having not just journalist as owner, but the sort of editorial board structure? So obviously the Scott Trust is one. There are editorial boards globally. Do you have an editorial board, Joshi?
I don't have an editorial board, no.
No. But how important is it to have, as a journalist founder, to have sort of people at the heart of these news organisations to help maintain and understand the importance?
Yeah, I mean, I felt when I needed some money 2 years ago because we wanted to launch in a new city, a journalist in Birmingham had been in touch and said, I'd love to do to work for you guys in Birmingham. We didn't have the money, so we raised a small amount of money, £350,000. And I specifically wanted to find investors who are really passionate about journalism. So I went around and tried to find people who could bring expertise and who could be a sounding board. So when I tried to get Mark Thompson to invest, I was saying to him, I really want to have your expertise. I know that he cares about journalism because he's run all these amazing media companies. Nick Johnson from Axios, same thing. I wanted him on board because he's got a track record of really caring about great journalism. So I think it is important to have those kind of investors. There are definitely examples of media companies in the local space that clearly don't have a board or a chief exec who cares about journalism enough, and I think you can see that in the UK. But I think we should take optimism from the examples that are out there. I mean, a lot of my favourite journalism is published by the media companies I mentioned 2 minutes ago, who are privately owned, who are for-profit entities, who have boards that have important journalistic figures on them. Nothing's perfect. Will the Washington Post survive? I don't know, but in life, not every company is going to survive. Just because we liked a company for 200 years doesn't mean it's necessarily going to need to survive. I totally take Branko's point about power. Clearly, Google is a much bigger business than New York Times, but I think in 1910, Standard Oil or whatever Getty's company was probably a much bigger business than the New York Times then. I don't think we've ever been like one of the biggest businesses on the planet. I think that we need robust ownership from people who care about journalism, but also who really keep their eye on the ball. You need a board and a management team who want that company to have 200 more paying subscribers tomorrow than they have today. Not sort of hands-off grants where you get money and then you don't speak to people for 3 years. You want people who are not involved on the editorial, but on the business side, every month when you get together for the board meeting or whatever, they're saying, how can we do better? How can we grow faster? How can we serve the readers better? How can we add more things to our bundle? That's the kind of ownership and kind of oversight that I think media companies need in this very kind of competitive environment.
And maybe that's not having a control over the editorial, but really caring passionately about the future. I mean, coming back to Branko's point that these owners, the owner of the LA Times, Patrick Soon-Chung, he was seen as a great thing, a bit like Jeff Bezos at Washington Post. Actually, tech money coming in to journalism was very, very briefly in both cases. But then he had an editorial board and put on a bias monitor to make sure they had more sort of differences of opinions that agreed more with the new Trump administration. Is there a way of sort of making sure that is sort of guarded against? Or is it a good way to run the business?
It's not a good way to do business. I mean, they lost subscribers, they lost importance. I mean, LA Times used to be one of the giants of American media, and they're not anymore. They lost, probably just about all the talent. And the problem is that those businesses are so small in size to the rest of the properties. I'm talking about Bezos and Patrick as well, and the guys from CBS, Disney. I mean, Disney was, the one who settled the ABC. They don't want to, bring the rest of the empires into trouble with that. And unfortunately, the editorial independence and quality is obviously going to take a second backseat to it. So, I will literally sign up to everything that Joshi said. Like today, I'm really worried because we are under genuine attack right now, and I think we should be aware of those things, and the structure in America especially is such that owner decides everything, and if somebody is going to protect $1 trillion business by sacrificing a few $100 million, so be it,
I'd like to talk now about transparency, because that's one of the things we talked about as a sort of business model and why it matters, particularly with ownership. And Basia, as part of the takeover, Tortoise, which is seen as this sort of great new sort of entry into the journalism world, the sort of issue of who owns Tortoise. Do you think enough was done to sort of say who the owners are and how much they have? Can you talk us through the sort of structure of ownership?
Yes, I mean, all of Tortoise's shareholders, investors are publicly available on Companies House. And I think 90% of the new investors in the New Observer are public. I think there's just one more to be announced.
And you can't share that today, who the new investors
are? No, I can't share that
today.
Well,
it was like news stories in Fruja as well.
But transparency is incredibly important. But this was also a commercial deal. And so I think the argument is that until the deal closes, there needs to be some element of kind of privacy around, particularly in these final moments, about who's going to invest. But I think most of them are public. And once the deal closes on the 22nd, the investors will be made public, or the final ones. But I think, it's right to scrutinise who owns media organisations, and I think it's right, to scrutinise how the Observer deal was done. The new kind of structure is an editorial board that will sit above the newsroom, which will be chaired by Richard Lambert, who's the former editor of the Financial Times, the Scott Trust, which have also invested in the Observer, and will also have a representative on the editorial board and the company board. So, I think there is as I see it, an attempt to show that this is a long-standing relationship, that the values of the Scott Trust will be continually present in the new organisation. And I feel that we as journalists who work at Tortoise, we've been sort of briefed along the way. We don't feel like there's any sort of hidden things that we're not aware of. And it's the same of the New Observer colleagues who are transferring over. One of the really nice things about working for a smaller media organisation is I have found they're much more open about how the company operates.
No, it's wrong. Joshi, you want to come in?
It's interesting, actually, because presumably James Harding started Tortoise and therefore owns a large chunk of the business. Now they're buying the Observer. Presumably that means James owns a large chunk of the Observer. That must mean that it's the only British national newspaper that has a large degree of journalistic ownership.
Although Basia can help us.
I think I have sought clarification on this point. No shareholder in the enlarged company will have more than 10%, including James.
Yeah, so I don't mean a controlling state, but I mean it's interesting. I mean, he is a journalist, not a bad one, edited the Times, ran the BBC. He started Tortoise. He now has a stake in a national newspaper. So that's kind of that's journalism ownership. I don't know about the other investors, but that seems like a good thing to me.
But can I also add, and I think we have been very inspired by The Atlantic, and one of the things that Nick Thompson said, who's the CEO of The Atlantic, said, we're not looking to make a lot of money, we're looking to make a small amount of money for a very long period of time. And I think that is, what is happening with The Observer is a positive and exciting thing, because we want to grow it so that over time we can invest more into its journalism. And digitally, in my role, that is a exciting thing that I haven't seen happen in all the time I've been working in journalism. So, it's right to talk about the nitty-gritty, but I think there is an overall thing to say, which is like, this will be, I think, a very exciting moment in the UK.
I like that line, a small amount of money, but over a long time. This is about funding and sustainability. Branko, do you think... I know you and I share a huge amount of sort of concern over what's happened in terms of the last 20 years with some of the sort of big news organisations and how to make money. It once was a licence to print money. It always came with power. Now, this idea of being able to make enough money, and do you feel, is that inspiring to you?
Absolutely. Look, I mean, one of the reasons we find ourselves globally in this situation, because a lot of the owners are hanging to the same dream. They're going to be able to make a lot of money, which is just not realistic anymore. So in South Africa, as my partner Stili Haralambous keeps saying, we are for profit, but we have actually, profit hope. What is the profit? What is the? Yeah, profit. Profit. What is the? Can you tell me? No, there was something about. Anyway, I forgot. Anyway, we had this profit ambition.
Okay.
Actually, Daily Maverick turned profit last year. I think it needed me to leave as the editor-in-chief to turn profit, for the year. But we were, again, as long as you pay your bills, it's fine. If while paying your bills, you're actually fulfilling this absolutely crucial duty to the environment around you, and if you're national or local publications, to whatever your intended audience is. What happened is that and I'll be talking about Mark Thompson. I mean, he's now facing this almost impossible task of restoring the CNN profits to the old days when they used to make $1.5 billion. Contribution to the greater entity. I don't think it will ever happen again. And and I really think that we as media need to kind of become more reasonable about our ambitions and don't kill ourselves in the process of trying to restore our previous financial glory. In South Africa, as a result of big organizations, corporations. And this, to come back to what George said, what actually separated us from the rest is that we were not corporately owned. We were owned by few of us who were, the journalists and editors, And corporations, in order to hold on to profits, they shed everything, including training. Yeah. So now in South Africa, you have a gap between, let's say, 35 and 50 years old journalists. Incredible gap. Those people who are supposed to take over, the media, they're not there because they were not trained, because the corporations got the training, and they were not bringing new talent. So we as a group, as a media, we made catastrophic mistakes, if I may say that. The sooner we accept the reality that, big profits are a thing of the past, and that paying your bills is the new thing, that's great.
Yoshoni, you want to say something, but I think I'm just trying to keep an eye on the time. If anyone's got a question, put your hand up. Great, loads of questions. Okay, I think we've got another 6 minutes or so. There's a gentleman at the front. And there, and then, sorry, this side seems to have all the questions. And then I can see Damien and someone behind him. So if you can have you, and then you in the white top, and then that way and that way. Thank you.
Hi, thank you all very much. One of the problems in our profession is that whereas we'd like to think that we still attract the best and brightest on the journalism side, on the business side, our business, because it no longer makes the kind of money that, Branko, you were talking about, no longer attracts the best. It doesn't attract the best marketing people, the best sales people, the non-journalism functions. Does the change in ownership change that? And Joshi, you're starting a new organization. When you're thinking about hiring folks on the business side, what is your experience? Are you attracting the best talent?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I actually think the thing you've put your finger on about the lack of great management and leadership talent in media companies is a huge problem. It's actually been a huge problem for a long time. When I'm trying to hire people, I'm trying to get people fired up about our vision, right, which is to lead a genuine renaissance in quality local journalism in the UK, and people do care about that. So I think I'm able to attract people who would never normally kind of come and work for a small startup. But I think it's a really good point. I think the type of ownership you have probably does affect the kind of talent you can get on the business side. I suspect, but don't know, that there are quite a few people who are great marketing people or they're great operations people who would not go and work for a slightly sleepy non-profit, but would go and work for a privately owned business that feels more dynamic. However, that's a huge generalization. There are some amazing marketing people who do work for non-profit newsrooms. Some of them have been on panels this week. And so it's not a super clear correlation between type of ownership and getting that talent, but I totally agree with you that incentivizing really, really good people to come in and lead and manage newsrooms is one of the central challenges. And if offering people a bit of like private share equity in you know, so that they're incentivized to grow the business, I think that isn't a bad way to do it.
Thank you. So if you could give it to Damien, and then this man with the white top. Should we do two questions at once, actually? Oh, no, go on. Damien, you give your, you ask your question.
Me?
Yeah.
Thanks. Branko started by saying that the press in America weren't protected by any law. But I think maybe a law that's been missing from the discussion is the law of media ownership and media pluralism. So lots of people in civil society and academia have been calling for an updating of these laws, for example, that might prevent the purchase of media companies by large foreign big tech platforms, for example, so that we wouldn't have to rely on hope or a bet to resolve this issue between Branko and Joshi. So these laws are normal. They are in the EU treaties, which mention media pluralism. Every country has different ones, but they largely prevent too much media concentration and the wrong people owning the media, foreign companies, foreign states, religious organizations, in some cases, political parties. So I'm just wondering whether the journalists on the panel might, and in the room, might think about their role in potentially raising awareness of these laws to protect media pluralism and media ownership, so that if this transaction does happen, and I agree strongly that there's a danger that this kind of transaction will happen, Parliament has thought about this in advance, in a bipartisan way, and we don't have to rely on ministerial discretion or some other blocking mechanism. Because we've known for some time that there's a danger. It's a danger to democracy and public opinion, yet we're very slow in updating these laws.
I've got views on that, but Branko, what do you think?
Yeah, I fully agree on, but, to get just about any country in the world to have a bipartisan or across-board agreement, it's going to be very, very difficult. But if it's possible, I would definitely agree with it, at least at the EU level.
Is this, did you still want, I don't know what's happening with the other, I don't think that one's working. I mean, isn't it also the case that if somebody comes in who's pro the current government, there are ways of reading the law to make sure it's fine? And the only time it tends not to happen is when you have something like a very controversial campaign against, so the Abu Dhabi experience, for example. So as you say, actually raising awareness, if there seriously is a bad deal happening, is probably the only way. Sorry, and thank you for your patience.
I have to thank you, Jane. Fernando Morales de la Cruz is my name. I'm a journalist who has been in Davos 15 times since 2007. And one of my complaints to the journalists in Davos, and not to Jane, because she actually published an article about my fight against all the men of Davos. Thank you again for that one. But one of my problems is that who owns the world? And when you have a meeting like Davos, and you have thousands and thousands of journalists who have been there, and they are actually not doing anything to challenge their power and to defend the people outside of this conclave, we have a really serious problem. So I dare to agree with Branko that we have a terrible situation where the big tech and all of the big corporates, and including sovereign wealth funds like Norway, are controlling more and more of the media. But I dare to ask, maybe we are still on time to challenge Norway, which owns shares in 8,500 corporations and in hundreds of newspapers. But I think we are still on time. And I think a few journalists like Jane and Bessia and Joshi and Branko can still challenge these people. Thank you.
It's a positive note. Oh, and actually, amazingly, that was not planned. Amazingly, I'm being told that's the last question. I was going to ask how much you felt owners were to blame for the current situation, but I think possibly better to end on that entirely positive note. So thank you so much to my fabulous panel, Joshi, Basha and Branko. Thank you.